Cinemassacre's Monster Madness. Bloodthirsty Thursday.
I've already reviewed all the classic Universal monster films, at least all the major ones, so now I'd like to talk about one that never got made. I think talking about non-existing films can sometimes be just as interesting. After Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman in 1943, Universal saw the potential of their own cinematic universe, so they hired Bernard Schubert to write a script for a follow-up called The Wolfman Vs Dracula. If that was the real title, it could have been the first film with verses in the title. Schubert also wrote Mark the Vampire and The Mummy's Curse. Some people think it was The Mummy's Ghost, but it wasn't. Obviously, the movie was never made and the script was lost until decades later it was found in a box in his garage, supposedly, and it's been published by Philip J. Riley, who not only released this, but a whole series of books dedicated to classic monster scripts that were never made into films. It's strange that there seem to be no other sources. There's little to no information about it anywhere except for this right here. So some people say it's a hoax, but I believe it's real. Obviously, the poster is fake. They took the images from other posters, but the script has to be real. You know why? Dracula and the Wolfman never fight. If this was fan fiction, nobody today would call it Wolfman vs. Dracula without having the Wolfman fight Dracula. Technically, they do fight, sort of, but the Wolfman is in human form and Dracula is in bat form, a giant bat. I guess Larry Talbot versus the giant Dracula bat didn't have as good a ring. This is the kind of shit they would pull back in the 40s. It's very much in tune with some of the other movies. They always had a problem with juggling multiple monsters. For example, in House of Frankenstein, Dracula appears in the first act, then is quickly destroyed by sunlight before the Wolfman and the Frankenstein monster appear. But the focus is on the Wolfman while the monster lays dormant in the lab, and right after the Wolfman's killed by a silver bullet, the monster finally rises in the last few minutes. That's the kind of thing they do here. Larry and Dracula interact a lot, but only after Dracula is destroyed does Larry finally become the Wolfman at the very end. At least that's the first time you see him as the Wolfman on screen. He does become the wolf in the beginning, but you only see his shadow. His shadow, how would I know that? Well, the script is very specific about the camera angles. Nowadays, you don't do that. At least that's how I was taught. You're supposed to let the director decide on the camera angles. Although if the writer is creative enough, the screenplay can suggest camera angles by how it's worded. But this script is all over the place with close-up, wide shot, and so on. That clues me in that this was genuinely from the 40s. Not to mention, it's written very sloppily, like this was the first draft before Universal pulled the plug. There's actually some parts where the wrong character is speaking and it's real confusing. It was meant to be shot in Technicolor, which is hard for me to imagine. I picture this in black and white, but that's not the first time Universal tried to do something in color. They were going to do it for Son of Frankenstein, but they did a makeup test of Karloff in color, and for whatever reason decided it wasn't the right choice, so they went with traditional black and white. The 1943 version of Phantom of the Opera ended up being in color, so maybe they allocated the budget towards that, rather than Wolfman vs. Dracula, which would have been made that same year or shortly after. Lots of the script refers to stock footage. Anytime there's a shot of the castle or a full moon or anything they already shot for another film, they were planning to recycle that. But all that footage was black and white, so were they planning to colorize it somehow or maybe just tint it? For casting, supposedly they were considering Bela Lugosi as Dracula. This would have been his first comeback to the character. They had already done Son of Dracula, which starred Lon Chaney Jr. as Dracula. Nowhere in the movie do they refer to him as the son. The title is wrong, so he is Dracula. But anyway, Chaney was the major monster player of this time. But for Wolfman vs. Dracula, he couldn't play Dracula because he was the Wolfman. In Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, what'd they do? Cast Lugosi as the monster. This time was no different. I can confirm this because, according to the would-be cinematographer, when he was interviewed by Philip Riley, he said Dracula and Larry Talbot would have looked like the same person, so they chose Lugosi. That's the reason to cast Lugosi? How about because he's Dracula? He's the best and always will be. Now let's get to the plot. It begins with Larry's corpse being discovered with a silver bullet in his heart, and lying next to him is the skeleton of a woman. It's no sequel to Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. It doesn't follow any continuity, but strangely, this seems to pick up right after House of Frankenstein, which wasn't even made yet. So maybe this is where they got that idea for House of Frankenstein. Anyway, a doctor ends up removing the bullet from his heart, and this brings him back to life. So the bullet only kept his heart from beating and put him in a state of suspended animation. That's why his body didn't decay like the girl's. That type of logic is what you'd expect from these movies. So now Larry's up and about, and he briefly becomes a wolf in shadow, as I mentioned. Now he's looking to die again to end his curse. Another bit of logic that's quite necessary is they explain why Larry can't just shoot himself with a silver bullet. You'd think he could just do it and be done with it, but here they address that he can only be killed when he's in wolf form. And when he's in wolf form, that's the only time when he doesn't want to die. So he goes to a hangman named Anatol, I guess thinking that since Anatol's job is to execute people, maybe he wouldn't mind. Well, of course, Anatol thinks he's crazy like the rest, but it just so happens Dracula is trying to marry his daughter, Yvonne. But now Larry falls in love with her, so there's this love triangle going on. That's the basic setup. After that, the plot takes many twists and turns. Larry ends up marrying Yvonne and then begins wishing to stay alive, looking for a cure rather than death. There's also some weird thing about Dracula being a doctor and trying to cure Larry just to trick him away from Yvonne. They totally missed an opportunity to call him Dr. Acula. They needed Ed Wood. Also, Dracula is always turning into a wolf. Yes, Dracula is a wolf more often than the Wolfman. Now here's the really confusing part. Dracula turns into a wolf and kills somebody, and Larry gets the blame. That would have been an interesting idea for Dracula to frame Larry so that everybody blames the wrong wolf, but instead they treat it as if it was a human murder. So the fact that Dracula was a wolf wasn't even important at all. I really thought they were going to do something interesting there. Everyone believes Larry is a murderer, but they don't believe he's a werewolf. It's hilarious how far it can go before somebody figures out what we all know. At the end, Larry stabs Dracula with a crucifix while he's in bat form. Then he becomes the Wolfman, goes on a little rampage, then Anatol shoots him with the silver bullet, and that's the basic rundown. It's a sloppy mess, but that's what a lot of these movies were like. So I can really imagine this as one of those. It has the graveyard, the castle, all the things you'd expect. When I read this, I could clearly see it in my mind, as if I was watching a Universal monster film that I've never seen. Even though it was never made, it seems as if it had an influence. Return of the Vampire came out in 1944, featuring both a werewolf and a vampire, played by Bela Lugosi. The silver bullet idea ended up being used in House of Frankenstein. Dracula ended up being included with the rest of the monster mashes. Larry began looking for a cure instead of death in House of Dracula, and the Wolfman and Dracula actually did end up fighting in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. So it's possible that this script is where it all sprang from.